channel bar would get some usage, and we wanted to work with some content providers to show off the channel bar. And I can't give you the reasoning behind any part of the ICP agreement because I wasn't involved in those.
What I'm asking you now is whether you, as you sit here now, can think of any legitimate reason why Microsoft would be getting content providers to agree not to pay Netscape. I'm not talking about getting them to try to use your channel bar. I'm talking about getting them to agree not to pay Netscape.
You'd have to ask somebody else why they put that in the agreement, unless you're asking me to just speculate wildly.
Well, I don't know whether it would be wild speculation or not, but what I'm asking you is whether you, as you sit here now as the chief executive of Microsoft, can think of any legitimate reason for Microsoft getting content providers to agree not to pay Netscape.
Object to the question as lacking foundation.
Now, I'm not aware of any broad prohibition against paying Netscape for anything. I think there was something about, relative to the channel bar, we wanted some of the premier partners, which was a very small number, to talk about their work with us, and it would have been embarrassing if all those same people were in the same relationship with Netscape in that time period.
In your answer in which you said that you thought you recalled some of the things that you were told in preparation for your hearing testimony, you were the one, were you not, just a few minutes ago, who said that you recalled that there was some provision that even if the content provider was on another channel bar, they couldn't pay for it. Do you recall saying that just a few minutes ago?
Mm-hmm.
You've got to say yes for the report.
Yes.
Now, that's what I'm asking about. What I'm asking is whether you can think of any legitimate reason why Microsoft would get a content provider to agree not to pay Netscape.
I can guess about that if you want.
Well, what I'm asking it is not whether you can guess why you did it, because we could all guess maybe why you did it. What I'm asking is whether you can think of any legitimate reason that would justify doing that.
Sure.
What?
Well, someone might have said, geez, it'd be embarrassing if all these same people appeared in Netscape's equivalent in that time period. Let's have them agree not to appear at all. And then someone else might have said, no, let's not be that restrictive. Let's just make it less likely they'll appear by saying that they won't pay Netscape to appear.
But if you're going to let them appear, why would you try to stop them from paying to appear?
It lowers the probability that they'll appear.
And why does it do that, sir?
Because there's lots and lots of content providers, and so if you the channel bar, these gold or premier or platinum, I forget the terminology, slots, there's only visually, at least in the way we did it, room for about 5 or 6 of those. And so if you have a contract that says that they won't take money from Netscape to appear in their channel bar, given the broad universe of content providers that are out there, it's very likely that Netscape will choose to pick people who do pay them to be in their channel bar, and therefore you've lowered the probability that all of the people who appear in yours also appear in Netscapes.
So that precluding people from paying was an indirect way of trying to make sure that they didn't appear on Netscape's channel bar. Is that right?
Now you've changed things. I've told you I don't know why the provision was put in there. You asked me if I could think of any set of reasoning behind it, in which I did, and then you changed and asked me a question about the history, which again I can't talk to you about the history.
And I don't mean to be asking just about the history. What I mean to be asking is whether you, as the Chief Executive Officer of Microsoft, and you testified yesterday about some practices that you thought were consistent and some practices that you thought were inconsistent with company policy. And is it consistent with company policy? Let me approach it this way. To get companies like content providers to agree not to pay competitors? Is that consistent with company policy if that was done?
Objection.
Our company policy is that when we're doing agreements, we rely on the expertise of our Law and Corporate Affairs Department to look at those and make sure that they're appropriate. That's one of the things that's done in agreements like that.
Well, other than whatever your lawyers tell you that you can't do, which I don't want to ask about because I think they'll probably object on the grounds of privilege, do you have a company policy that addresses the issue of whether it is appropriate for Microsoft people to enter into agreements that limit companies from doing business with Microsoft's competitors?
There's no general policy that covers that area. As I said, the very competent staff we have is involved in reviewing agreements we reach.
Did you ever have any conversations with anyone about whether or not they could deal with a competitor of Microsoft?
And that's open-ended enough. I'm not sure what you mean at all. There's lots.
I mean to keep it open-ended as an initial question, and then if you say no, then I don't have to go through it. But if you say yes, then I go through who you met with and what you said.
Let's have the open-ended question read back if we could.
Did you ever have any conversations with anyone about whether or not they could deal with a competitor of Microsoft?
I'd say the answer is probably yes, because
If the
for
answer
example,
is yes, then I want to
no,
ask.
I want to make. I think I should give an example so you understand how I interpreted your question.
Could you give me a specific example?
Yes,
That is, somebody that you
IBM
have.
is a competitor of ours, and people have said to me, "Should we fly out and meet with IBM on this topic?" And I've said, in some cases, yes, we should, and in some cases, no, we shouldn't. So that's a case where I was giving people advice on whether they should deal with a competitor of Microsoft.
Were these people within Microsoft?
People, yes.
Okay. Now, have you ever had any personal conversation with anyone other than a Microsoft employee as to whether that person's company could or should deal with a competitor of Microsoft?
Well, in terms of should, I might have said to somebody that,
No, I'm not asking what you might have said. What I'm asking is what you remember doing. Yeah, I'm trying to move this along. I'm trying to stay as concrete as I can, and I'm not asking you to speculate about what you might have done.
Okay,
I'm
I
asking
know-
you what
I know
you remember doing.
I know concrete cases where I've told customers that I think picking our product as opposed to a competitor's product is in their best interest, and so that they should pick our product. And in that sense, yes.
Have you told people that if they pick your product, they can't use a competitor's product?
If there's a technical issue about how things won't work together, possibly, but otherwise, no.
Do you know a Mr. Poole who works at Intuit?
No,
You do not.
no. I think you're confused.
You may be right. But all I need to do is get your testimony down, and then people can judge for themselves. So it is your testimony that you do not know anyone who works at Intuit, whose name Mr. Poole. Do you know somebody at Microsoft who deals with Intuit who is named Mr. Poole?
Yes, it's quite distinct.
Yes. The distinction is actually at the heart of what I'm going to answer. What is Mr. Poole's first name?
Will. That's at least what he goes by.
Right. And what is Mr. Will Poole's title?
I have no idea.
You have dealt directly and personally with Mr. Poole, have you not, sir?
Not until very recently.
When was the first time that you dealt directly and personally with Mr. Poole?
Well, if you mean was he ever on an email that I went back and forth on, that probably goes back, that could be any time in the last few years. In terms of actually being in a meeting that Will was in, I think that's quite recent.
When?
Which? Both. I said in terms of email, that would be the last couple of years. How can I be more concrete than
I
that?
don't know.
I answered the question.
Can you be more concrete than the last couple of years?
No.
Okay. Now, when with respect to the meeting?
I don't think I was in a meeting that he was in until maybe 2 or 3 months ago.
Did you ever have a discussion with Mr. Poole, either orally or through an email, in which you told Mr. Poole what the conditions were pursuant to which Microsoft would give Intuit access to a position on the active desktop?
There may have been mail on that general topic, but I don't remember any specific mail.
Did you have any discussions with Mr. Poole apart from email?
No.
Did you tell Mr. Poole in words or in substance that Intuit could get access to a position on the active desktop only if it would agree not to deal with Netscape?
There may have been some discussion about whose browser technology Intuit choose to integrate its products with. There certainly wasn't anything broadly about dealing with Netscape.
Well, let me try to be as precise as I can. Did you tell Mr. Poole in words or in substance that if Intuit wanted to have access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to agree to use Microsoft's browser technology and not use Netscape's browser technology?
I don't remember that specifically, but I do know that we were, in various time periods, endeavoring to get into it to choose the componentized IE technology as the way that Quicken, the default way that Quicken would bring up a browser. In fact, they've always supported both browsers at all times.
My question to you is whether you told Mr. Poole, either orally or through email, that in order for Intuit to get access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to agree not to use the Netscape browser technology. Did you tell Mr. Poole that orally or through email?
I know we were talking with Intuit about using IE as the default browser because of our technology. So in that sense of being the default, we were trying to get them to favor IE. But I don't remember any specific thing beyond that.
So is it your testimony that you do not remember telling Mr. Poole in words or in substance that if Intuit was to have access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to agree not to use the Netscape browser technology?
Intuit has supported the Netscape browser technology at all times, and I never thought there was any chance of avoiding them supporting the Netscape browser technology. I did think there was a chance that we would become the default, and I was hoping we could convince them that it made sense for them to make us the default.
Default browser.
That's right.
I understand that that's what you said, and I do want to explore that, but I want to first be clear that it is your testimony that you never told, or at least you don't recall ever telling Mr. Poole in words or in substance, that in order to get access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to agree not to deal with Netscape or not to use the Netscape browser technology.
I don't remember using those exact words.
How about substance?
In terms of substance, my desire to get us to be the default did imply a favorable position for us relative to other browsers.
Is it fair to say that your position with respect to wanting to become the default browser for Intuit meant that the Microsoft browser would have a more favorable position, but it would not preclude Intuit from dealing with Netscape? Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Now, I want to follow up on that issue. But before I do, I want to be absolutely certain that I have your testimony now clear. And that is, leaving aside the issue of becoming the default browser, did you ever tell Mr. Poole in words or in substance that in order for Intuit to have access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to agree not to deal with Netscape or not to use the Netscape browser technology? Did you ever communicate that to Mr. Poole in words or in substance?
You can't leave out the idea of the default browser. It's nonsensical to say, did you do that, but leaving out the notion of the default browser. The substance of us being the default browser is that that's a favorable position for our browser. So what you've just asked me is nonsensical.
Does making Internet Explorer the default browser preclude Intuit from dealing with Netscape?
In a specific way, yes.
In what way?
Any deal that relates to them being the default browser.
Other than a deal that involves them becoming the default browser, does it preclude Intuit from dealing with Netscape?
Not necessarily.
So that Intuit could make Internet Explorer its default browser, but still deal with Netscape with respect to Netscape's browser. Correct?
Yeah, Intuit at all times has supported the Netscape browser.
Now, I think it has to be clear from what you've just said that it is your view that becoming the default browser does not preclude Intuit from dealing with Netscape completely in terms of browsers. Is that fair?
Well, it was the issue that would have been of the most interest to us.
I'm not asking what the interest was that you had or what the issue was that was of most interest to you. What I'm asking is whether, aside from the issue of the default browser, you ever told Mr. Poole in words or in substance that in order for Intuit to get access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to agree not to deal with Netscape or not to use the Netscape browser technology at all?
The question doesn't make sense to me. If you say that somebody's not the default, you're certainly affecting how they deal with you on the browser.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
We wanted to convince Intuit to make us the default browser.
And making you the default browser, does that preclude them from dealing with Netscape at all in terms of browsers?
Not in every respect, no.
Okay, not in every respect. Did you ever tell Mr. Poole, in words or in substance, that if Intuit was going to obtain access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to stop supporting the Netscape browser?
Well, supporting can mean a lot of different things.
I mean what
I know.
you mean when
I
you
never
said it.
expected at any time that they would not support the Netscape browser in terms of running with it, working with it, supporting it, and all those things. In terms of did I use that specific word? No, I don't have a recollection. But support can mean quite a few things.
What I'm not doing right now is asking what you meant by support. What I'm asking you is whether you told Mr. Poole that. Do you understand the distinction?
Did I use those words?
That you told Mr. Poole.
See, if you're going to ask me, did I use the exact words, you can ask me that question. Or if you're going to ask me if I said something like that, that's okay. But then I have to actually understand what you mean by the words.
Okay, let's take it one step at a time. Did you tell Mr. Poole that if Intuit was to have access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to stop, quote, supporting, close quote, or could no longer, quote, support, close quote, the Netscape browser?
What does it mean when you keep going in and out of quotes like that?
It means you use the word supporting or you use the word support.
In that case, you should put the document in front of the witness.
I'm just asking whether he ever communicated that orally or in writing or by email to Mr. Poole.
No,
I think you
what
twice
did it?
testified.
What did it
No,
mean?
you think he's twice testified what?
I think you twice testified in the scope of your questions about things he said. And so if you have a document...
No,
at some
I'm just
point,
asking
put
him
it
whether
down.
he said it. Just asking him whether he said it.
Whether I said what?
Well, whether you told Mr. Poole that if Intuit was to have a position on the active desktop, that Intuit would have to agree to stop supporting or could no longer support. That is, you use the word support the Netscape browser. Did you do that, sir? In email communications or orally or in any other form of communications to Mr. Poole?
I don't remember using those words, if that's the question.
Do you remember whether or not you used those words?
No.
Let me turn now to the substance of what you told Mr. Poole. And what I'd like you to describe for me in your own words, what did you tell Mr. Poole, either orally or by any other form of communication, Intuit would have to agree to in order to get access to a position on the active desktop?
Objection. I may be mistaken, but I think the question lacks foundation.
I will rephrase the question. What, if anything, did you tell Mr. Poole?
I'm not sure if I told Mr. Poole or Mr. Chase or Todd Nielsen or who, but I'm sure I communicated that the kind of support Intuit had been giving where Netscape was the default browser, that I didn't see that as consistent with agreeing with them for them to be featured on the active channel bar.
I think that goes to what you were saying before, which is that you wanted Microsoft's browser to become the default browser.
That's right.
Okay, now what I'm trying to do is ask whether you went beyond that in talking to Mr. Poole. Did you say to Mr. Poole that if Intuit is going to get access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit had to do something more than simply make IE the default browser?
That was my goal there, which of course would imply a change in how they'd been supporting Netscape as the default browser.
Right. I understand that you said you wanted IE to be the default browser, and that inevitably means that Netscape's can't be the default browser because you can only have one default browser, right?
Right.
Now, what I'm now asking is, did you go beyond that and say to Mr. Poole that if Intuit was going to get access to a position on the active desktop, Intuit would have to do something more than simply make IE the default browser?
I don't think so.
Did you ever say that to Mr. Chase or to anyone else?
I don't think so.
Or communicate it in email or some other communication?
I included that. So, no, I don't think so.
Okay. I thought you might have included it, but I wasn't sure, so I wanted to be clear.
If we've come to a logical stopping point within this small subset of this point, let's break for lunch.
Okay.
Okay.
Time is 11:54. We're going off the record. This is the end of tape 2 of the deposition of Bill Gates on August 28th. There, by my count, about